Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 8, Jacques Rousseau, and we start with topic Critique of Civil Society. The themes introduced in his prize-winning essay were developed further in his second essay written in 1754 on what is the origin of inequality among men and is it authorized by natural law. The second discourse, as this essay is called, is a narrative of the fall of man, how his nature got twisted, wrapped, and corrupted with the emergence of civil society, which in turn was necessitated by the rise of the institution of private property and the need to defend it by institutionalizing social inequality through law. Here, Rousseau is extolling the natural man and pouring scorn over the so called civilized man. The problem evidently was not with man but the nature of society in which he was living. Tracing the fall, Rousseau says that in the state of nature, which is a condition prior to the emergence of society, man was a noble savage, lived in isolation, and had a few elementary, easily appraised needs. It was neither a condition of plenty nor scarcity, neither there was conflict nor cooperative living. There was no language or knowledge of any science or art. In such a situation, man was neither happy nor unhappy, had no conception of just and unjust, virtue and vice. The noble savage was guided not by reason, but by true instinct, self love, or the instinct of self preservation, and sympathy, or the gregarious instinct. The state of nature, which was one of innocence, did not last forever. Of course, of the time, the noble savage, which lived in isolation, discovered the utility and usefulness of labor, without yet having given up their primitive dispersal. Men begin to collaborate occasionally and created a degree of provisional order. Later, men began to build shelters for themselves and families, stayed together, a stage Rousseau calls a patriarchal stage. But as he consolidated his first social relations, he gave himself to labor and to thought, that is, to the use of reason and language. This brought in the first fall for man, wrenching him from the happiness of the patriarchal stage, even as the discovery of division of labor enabled men to pass from a subsistence economy to an economy of productive development. The emergence of metallurgy and agriculture was indeed a great revolution, but iron and corn, which civilized men, ruined humanity. The civilization of earth led to the enclosure of land, and this necessarily gave rise to the idea of property. As Rousseau puts it in a famous statement, the first man who, after fencing off a piece of land, took it upon himself to say, "This belongs to me," and found people simple minded enough to believe, was the true founder of the civil society. Once men began to claim possessions, the inequality of man's talent and skill led to an inequality of fortunes. Wealth enabled some men to enslave others. The very idea of possession excited men's passions and provoked competition and conflict. Conflict led in turn to a demand for a system of law for sake of order and tranquility. The rich especially voiced with this demand, for while the state of violence threatened everyone's life, it was worse for the rich because it threatened their possessions also. Hence, the expedient of a social contract was thought of by a rich man to the detriment of the poor. The result, says Rousseau, was the origin of civil society and laws, which gave new fetters to the poor and new powers to the rich, which destroyed natural liberty forever, fixed for all the law of property and inequality, transformed shrewd usurpation into settled right, and to benefit a few ambitious people, subjected the whole of human race henceforth to labor, servitude, and wretchedness. Rousseau suggests, however, that things need not have turned out as badly as they had, if, with the establishment of the government, men ran headlong into chains. That was because men had the sense to see the advantages of political institutions, but not the experience to foresee the dangers. To this theme, Rousseau was to return some years later in the social contract. It may, however, be noted here that Rousseau was not depicting the transition from state of nature to civil society as a historical fact. Rather, the above account has to be understood as hypothetical reasoning calculated to explain the nature of things, than to ascertain their actual origin. Now let us discuss next point, social contract. Though Rousseau critiqued civil society, he did not suggest man to choose the savage existence as some of his contemporaries mistook him. In fact, Voltaire even ridiculed Rousseau for wanting us to walk on all four. In the discourse itself, Rousseau exclaims, "What then is to be done? Must societies be totally abolished? Must mume and tume be annihilated, and must we return again to the forest to live among bears? This is a deduction in the manner of my adversities, which I would as soon anticipate and let them have the shame of drawing. There was thus no going back to the state of nature, for Rousseau society was inevitable, without which man could not fulfill him or realize his native potentials. If he was critiquing civil society, it was because it was not founded on just principles and had corrupting influence. The task, therefore, was to create a new social order that would help man realize his true nature. To such a task, Rousseau devoted himself in Social Contract. The key to the construction of the ideal social political order was to handle the problem of political obligation, namely, why should man obey the state through a proper reconciliation of authority with freedom, as it ought to be a task which, according to Rousseau, was unsatisfactorily and inadequately done by his predecessors philosophers. Social contract opens dramatically. Man is born free and he is everywhere in chains. His purpose is how to make the chains legitimate in place of the illegitimate chains of the contemporary society. With such a purpose, Rousseau's theoretical problem is to find a form of association capable of defending and protecting with the total common force the person and the property of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before through a social contract. The social contract involves the total alienation of each associate together with all his rights to the whole community. Each man gives himself to all. He gives himself to nobody in particular, as there is no associate over whom he does not acquire the same right as he yields over himself. He gains an equivalent for everything he loses, and he increase an increase of force for the preservation of what he has. Reduced to its essence, the participants of the social contract agree amongst themselves that each of us puts his person and all his power to the common use under the supreme direction of the general will. And as a body, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. As a result of the contract, the private person ceases to exist, for the contract produces a moral and collective body which receives from the same act its unity, its common identity, its life, and its will. This public person formed from the union of all particular individuals is the state when it is passive, the sovereign when it is active, a power when compared with similar institutions. After the institutions of a state, Rousseau visualizes a great transformation in the human being. It substitutes in his conduct a rule of justice for the rule of instinct and gives to his action a moral character which therefore he had lacked. Rousseau goes to the extent of saying that he is transformed from a stupid and limited animal into an intelligent creature and man. But such a transformation would be fantastic, quite improbable, if the contract is conceived as a single specific occurrence. But for Rousseau, the contract is not a single event, but a way of thinking. Thus conceived contract becomes a process, and we can think of alteration of human nature as also being gradual and not instantaneous. Here we have a conception of man whose moral sensibilities and intellectual prowess gradually evolves and develops pari passu with the widening and deepening of men's social relations, brought about by a continuous participation in the general will. Now we want to wind up this lecture and thank you so much for your attention.